The night my stepfather locked the door from the outside. I knew it wasn't the first time he'd tried to erase me. It was just the first time he used a deadbolt. I was 23. I'd moved back home to Moncton after finishing my diploma at NBCC because my mom had called me crying in February, saying she didn't know how to pay the heating bill, and I couldn't say no to that. I never could say no to her. That was always the problem. My stepfather, I'll call him what he was, not what he wanted me to call him, had been in her life since I was 15. He came in like someone who had all the answers, confident the way some men are confident, the kind where you don't realize until much later that it was never about knowing things, it was about making sure no one else felt like they did. He had a job at a sheet metal fabrication company out near the industrial park. Decent money, and he wore it like armor. The first time he told my mother her chicken was dry, I watched her apologize. I was 16. I filed that away somewhere and didn't open the folder again for years. By the time I moved back in, he had his systems. The grocery list had to be submitted by Thursday. The thermostat stayed at 19 degrees no matter the month. My bedroom, my childhood bedroom with the scuff on the baseboard where I used to kick off my boots, had a new lock on it, on the outside. For security, he told my mother. She nodded. I should have left that weekend. I keep coming back to that. I should have packed the same 2 bags I'd arrived with and driven my '09 Civic back to Moncton proper and found a room on Kijiji and eaten Mr. Noodles until I had steady paychecks. I should have done a lot of things. Instead, I stayed because my mother looked smaller than I remembered. She'd lost weight she didn't have to lose. There were new shadows under her eyes that had nothing to do with sleep. And when he walked into a room, she had this way of adjusting. Her shoulders, her voice, the angle of her face. Like a plant that's learned which way the bad weather comes from. I recognized it, even though I didn't have the word for it yet. I just knew she needed me there. What I didn't know was how much he resented that. It started with the small things, the way these things always start. He stopped speaking to me at dinner and started speaking about me. To my mother, while I sat 3 feet away, she left the back light on again. She used the good towels. She needs to understand this isn't a hotel. My mother would nod, and later she'd come to my room and apologize on his behalf without calling it that. Then it graduated. He started going through my things when I was at work. I knew because I'm someone who notices where I leave objects. My charger was always on the left side of the nightstand. 3 times in 1 week I came home and it was on the right. A letter from my bank had been opened and not quite resealed. My laptop was angled differently than I'd left it. I didn't say anything because I didn't have proof, and I knew how that conversation would go. I'd seen it go. That way, my whole adolescence, me with evidence I couldn't quite make stick, him with a story that fit better, and my mother choosing the version that let her sleep at night. I started taking photographs of my room before I left for work. Angles, positions, the state of my dresser. Evidence, I told myself. In case came faster than I expected. It was a Thursday in October. I remember, because I'd just picked up an extra shift at the dental office, where I worked reception, and I got home just after 7, which was later than usual. He didn't like it when routines changed. His routines, specifically, I'd barely gotten my coat off when he started. Something about the car blocking the driveway at an angle, which it wasn't. I'd been careful. I was always careful, I said, calmly. That I'd parked exactly where I always parked. That was my mistake. Not the parking, the calm. He didn't know what to do with calm from me. He was used to my mother's accommodation, and he'd expected mine would work the same way. You think you can just walk into this house and do whatever you want? He said. You're here because I allow it. I looked at my mother. She was standing at the kitchen counter, with her hands wrapped around a mug that had gone cold. Mom, I said. She looked at her mug. That was the moment I understood something I'd been refusing to understand for 8 months. She wasn't going to. Not tonight. Not in this situation. Maybe not in any situation while she still lived inside this particular fear. It wasn't that she didn't love me. I know that now. But love and protection are different muscles, and she'd stopped exercising one of them a long time ago. He stepped closer. I don't want to recount every second of what happened next, because some of it still lives in my body in a way I can't fully translate into words. What I will say is that there was a point where I understood, with absolute clarity, that I needed to get out of the house. Not tomorrow. Not after I called someone. Right then. I grabbed my purse off the hook by the door. He grabbed my arm. I pulled. He pulled harder. My shoulder hit the doorframe, and then I was outside. And the door was slamming behind me, and I heard the lock turn. Not the deadbolt. The regular lock. The one that meant he'd decided I wasn't coming back in tonight. My car keys were inside. My phone was inside, charging on the wrong side of the nightstand. I stood on the front step in October in Moncton in just my work clothes, dress pants, a blouse, flats, and I had my purse with my wallet in it and nothing else. I started walking. I didn't have a destination. I just knew that standing still felt dangerous in a way that moving didn't, so I moved. Down the street, around the corner, past the Tim Hortons that was doing enough business at 7 p.m. on a Thursday to feel like proof that normal life was continuing somewhere nearby. I thought about going in, but I didn't want to cry in a Tim Hortons. That felt like a specific kind of defeat. I ended up at Centennial Park. I don't know why. My feet just took me there. I sat on a bench near the pond and I put my face in my hands, and I let myself shake for a few minutes because I'd been holding my body very still since I walked out the door, and it needed to go somewhere. All that shaking. That's when I heard someone settle onto the other end of the bench. I didn't look up at first. I wasn't in the mood for a stranger, but after a moment I felt something. A presence that wasn't intrusive, just steady. Like someone who understood that sitting near a person in distress didn't require speaking, and I lifted my head. He was an older man. I'd put him in his late 60s. He was wearing a waterproof jacket, the serious kind. Not fashion outdoor, but actual outdoor, and he had a walking pole leaning against the bench beside him. His hair was white and close-cropped, and he was looking at the pond with the kind of patience that suggested he came here often and was never in a hurry. He glanced at me and nodded, the way Canadians acknowledge strangers, enough to confirm your existence, not enough to impose on it. I nodded back. I was trying to hold my face together. I failed, completely and suddenly, the way composure sometimes goes. Not gradually but all at once, like a power outage. I put my hand over my mouth, but it didn't help. And I started crying in a way I hadn't cried in years. Not the quiet, controlled kind, but the kind that comes from somewhere foundational. I didn't expect him to do anything. People look away from that kind of crying. It's uncomfortable, it's too much, it belongs somewhere private. But he reached into his jacket pocket and held something out toward me. A travel pack of Kleenex. I stared at it for a second. Then I took it. "Thank you," I said. My voice was wrecked. He tapped his ear and shook his head slightly, and made a small gesture, fingers pointing toward himself. Then a motion I didn't immediately understand. Then he picked up his phone, opened a notes app, typed something, and turned the screen toward me. "Deaf. But if you want to write." "I'm here." I looked at him. He had kind eyes, the unhurried kind, not pitying, just present. I took my wallet out of my purse, because there was a pen in there from work, the clicky kind we kept at reception. I found an old receipt. I wrote, "I got locked out of my house. I don't have my phone." He read it. He wrote back, "Do you have somewhere to go?" I wrote, "I don't know." He looked at me for a moment. Then he wrote, "My name is Gerald. I live 4 blocks from here. My wife is home. Would you like to come in and use the phone?" I should explain what I felt in that moment because it wasn't simple. It was the collision of two things: the genuine relief of being offered something safe, and the voice in my head that has kept me alive by being suspicious of strangers, especially men, especially in the dark. I sat with that collision for a few seconds. I looked at his face again. The walking pole. The Kleenex. The way he'd waited. I wrote, "Okay." His wife's name was Lorraine, and she opened the door before we'd reached the porch steps, because she'd apparently seen us coming up the walk. She was a small Acadian woman with reading glasses, pushed up on her head, and she took one look at me and said, in the particular tone of a woman who has handled more than her share of hard evenings, "Come in, sweetheart. I'll put the kettle on." I used their phone to call my friend Britt, who drove over from her apartment on St. George Street without asking a single question first, which is the exact quality that makes someone your real friend versus your surface friend. While I waited, I sat at Gerald and Lorraine's kitchen table and drank tea. And Lorraine didn't interrogate me. She just kept refilling my cup and eventually asked if I'd eaten. And when I said not really, she put a plate of leftover tortilla in front of me, like it was the obvious solution to all problems. Gerald sat across from me, and we passed his phone back and forth. He asked where I worked. I told him. He asked if I had family in the city. I told him it was complicated. He didn't push. I wrote, "Thank you for this, you didn't have to." He wrote back, "You looked like someone who needed a Kleenex." That part was obvious. I laughed for the first time in hours. It surprised me. Then he wrote, "Are you safe, going forward?" "Not tonight. Tonight your friend is coming. I mean generally." I looked at the question on the screen for a long time. "I don't know." I wrote again. The honest answer for the second time that night. He nodded slowly. Then he wrote something longer than his previous messages. And when he turned the screen toward me, I read it twice. I spent 34 years in the Canadian Armed Forces. Most of that time I worked with people in situations that felt permanent and weren't. What I learned is that the people who got through it were not always the strongest or the bravest. They were the ones who accepted help when it was offered and asked for it when it wasn't. You accepted the Kleenex. That's a stared at the screen. Then I looked up at him. He was a retired major general. I didn't know that yet. I found that out later, from Lorraine, who mentioned it the way you mention a fact you've stopped thinking of as remarkable. Gerald was at NDHQ for his last posting, she said, as if this explained the books on the shelf and the careful way he listened. What I knew in that kitchen, in that moment, was that something about him made me feel like the situation had edges I could hold on to, like it wasn't bottomless. Britt arrived 20 minutes later. She hugged me at the door and thanked Gerald and Lorraine with the kind of specificity that meant something. She looked them in the eyes. She said their names. She said, "I mean it." Then she drove me to her apartment and put me on her pull-out couch, and we talked until 2 in the morning. I stayed with Britt for 6 days. On the 3rd day, I went back to the house when I knew he'd be at work. My mother let me in. She looked like she hadn't slept. We stood in the kitchen. And she said she was sorry, and I said I know, and neither of us said the harder things yet, because we didn't have the language for them. Not then. I got my phone, my laptop, my important documents, birth certificate, SIN card, the folder of papers I'd started keeping in a fireproof box after he'd gone through my mail. And I got my 2 bags and I left. The harder conversation with my mother came later. It came in stages, the way real things do. She didn't leave him that week or the week after. That took longer, and it was her timeline, not mine, and I had to learn to hold that without making it mean she didn't love me. My therapist helped with that part. I started seeing her in November, a woman named Dr. something hyphenated who worked out of an office on Mountain Road. And the first thing she said that actually moved something in me was, "You can love someone and still protect yourself from the situation they're in." I wrote it on a Post-it. I still have it somewhere. In January, something happened at the dental office where I worked. One of our patients, a man in his 70s who came in every 6 months, regular as a calendar, mentioned making conversation while he waited for the freezing to kick in. That he'd been a patient of that practice for over a decade. He said he trusted the office. He asked how long I'd been there. I said almost 2 years. He said, "You're Good at making people feel settled. That's a skill. I thanked him. He said his name was Mr. Chamberlain, and that he'd retired from the federal public service some years back. He mentioned he had a colleague who ran a not-for-profit, offering transitional housing supports for women leaving unsafe situations in the greater Moncton area. He said it not pointedly, just conversationally, as if he was offering information and I could decide what to do with it. I wrote down the name of the organization on a prescription notepad we kept at reception. Later, I would learn that Gerald, the man from the bench, the retired Major General, had spoken to Mr. Chamberlain at the Legion and mentioned in careful general terms that he'd encountered a young woman in a difficult situation. That Gerald had thought about me after that night and wondered if I'd landed somewhere safe. That he'd asked Mr. Chamberlain, who had connections he didn't, if there was anything available. I didn't know any of that when I called the number on the notepad. I just called because I had. The organization connected me with a legal clinic that helped me understand my rights around recovering property from a shared address. They connected me with a housing coordinator who knew of a subsidized bachelor apartment that was becoming available in February in a building on the edge of Elmwood. They helped me apply for a one-time provincial stabilization fund for women exiting situations of domestic conflict, which I hadn't known existed. In New Brunswick, there are programs that don't advertise themselves, that you only find someone points you toward the door. I found the door. I got the apartment. $840 a month, utilities included, which in the current market felt like a lifeline. I moved in on February 1st with Britt's help, and a rented cargo van and a bed frame from Facebook Marketplace. My stepfather, meanwhile, had apparently decided that the best strategy was narrative control. There was a post in a local community Facebook group, one of those Moncton neighborhood groups, with 15,000 members, where someone had written, without naming me by name but describing the situation closely enough, that a family member had stolen property and damaged a relationship beyond repair. The implication was clear to anyone who knew us. I saw it because someone screenshotted it and sent it to me. I sat with it for 3 days. Then I wrote a response. Not in the group. I'm smarter than that. I wrote it as a formal statement to the RCMP officer who had come to the house on the night of the incident, when a neighbor called about the noise. I wrote it to the victim services coordinator who'd given me her card. I wrote it to my employer in the form of a factual timeline. I wrote it to my mother's doctor in the form of a letter asking her to please check in on my mother's well-being, signed her daughter. I didn't write it in anger. I wrote it like someone who had been filing documents in a folder for a long time and finally had enough to open the folder. The RCMP file had been sitting. It started moving. He was charged in March, uttering threats and mischief. It's not it's everything. It's never everything. There's no charge for the particular kind of slow erosion he'd done to my mother's sense of herself over 9 years. But it was something that had a file number and a court date and a record. He lost his job at the fabrication company when his employer found out. My mother, to her credit, and to no one's surprise but perhaps his, did not attend the proceedings in support of him. She attended in support of me. She sat 2 rows behind me in the courthouse on Lutz Street, and I could feel her there the whole time. When it was over and we were outside in the thin March light, she put her hand on my arm and said, "I'm sorry it took me so long." I said, "I know." Then we stood there for a minute not saying anything else, which was more honest than anything we'd said to each other in years. Gerald and Lorraine came to the courthouse that day. I hadn't asked them. Gerald had emailed me. We'd exchanged contact information that night in the kitchen, him typing into his phone and me writing my address on another receipt from my wallet. And he'd said only, "We thought we might come, if that's all right." I wrote back that it was more than all right. I told Lorraine afterward that I didn't have a word for what they were to me. People who had offered a kitchen table and a plate of tourtière when I had nothing, no phone, no key, nothing but a travel pack of Kleenex, and a decision to accept it. She laughed. She said Gerald always carried Kleenex because he'd been a father of daughters and he'd learned. I moved into my apartment on February 1st. By June, I had a full-time permanent position at a different dental office, with benefits, which in Canada means something real. It's a criminal act under military law. I was on the provincial dental coverage program, which covers the basics, but having employer benefits meant I could see a physiotherapist for the shoulder that had hit the door frame in October and had been quietly giving me trouble ever since. I could see my hyphenated name therapist without checking my balance first. My mother left him in April. She moved into a one-bedroom in the north end of the city, the first place she'd lived alone in over a decade. She called me on the day. She got the keys, and I drove over and we ordered pho from a place on St. George and sat on her floor because she didn't have furniture yet, and we ate out of containers and it felt like something. I think about the bench sometimes. The moment I sat down on it, I had no phone, no keys, no plan. I had a wallet with a debit card and $47 in cash and a pen from work. That was the complete inventory of what I had. And I sat there shaking in October in New Brunswick. And a man I didn't know offered me a small thing, the smallest thing, a travel pack of Kleenex. And I took it. I've thought about why I took it. I think it's because it was small enough to be safe. It wasn't a ride from a stranger. It wasn't a hotel room or a loan or a complicated obligation. It was Kleenex. I could take Kleenex. And because I took the Kleenex, I was still sitting there 2 minutes later when he held out his phone with that note on the screen. And because I was still sitting there, I went to the kitchen with the tourtière and the kettle. And because I was in the kitchen, I had a phone to call Britt. And because I called Britt, I had 6 days to figure out a next step. One thing opened the next thing. Gerald told me once, passing the phone back and forth over coffee at their kitchen table, which became a thing we did every few months. He wrote, "The bravest moment isn't usually the big one. It's the one just before the big one, where you make a small choice to stay present instead of collapsing." I printed that out and it lives on my fridge now, next to the post-it from my therapist. I don't know what my stepfather's life looks like now. I've heard he's still in the area. That's his right. It's a free country and Moncton is a city, and cities contain people you'd rather not think about. What I know is that he is not inside the walls of any place I sleep. He is not between me and a door. He does not have a key to any deadbolt in my life. My shoulder still aches when the weather changes, which in New Brunswick is constantly. My therapist says that's common. The body keeps accounts. I'm learning to treat it like information rather than punishment. Last October, on the 1-year mark of the night at the park, I drove to Centennial Pond in the evening. I didn't plan it. I just found myself going. I sat on a bench. Not necessarily the same one, but close. And I stayed there until I was cold, which wasn't long. And I watched the light change on the water. Nobody sat next to me. That was fine. I didn't need them to. I had my own Kleenex.